Today I'm going to talk about propaganda. So some guiding questions for this lecture are going to be, what is propaganda? What does propaganda do to people? And also, what does propaganda do for people? Now, the line separating propaganda from, say, publicity, public relations, advertising, and for that matter, information operations can be super blurry, right? Those are labels, like the label, for example, fake news. Those are labels that people deploy strategically to discredit their adversaries and to claim their own legitimacy, right? By labeling the other person's media as propaganda and your own as public relations, for example, or as news. Nowadays, propaganda is kind of a derogatory term. We think of it as a bad thing, a kind of illegitimate form of influence, but actually that wasn't always the case. In the early 20th century, the term had really more of a neutral ring to it, which we see, for example, in the 1928 book Propaganda by Edward Bernays, which is actually a pro-propaganda book written by a propagandist, arguing that propaganda is essential, in fact, for the smooth functioning of democracy. Edward Bernays himself worked for the U.S. government's Committee for Public Information during World War I, doing psychological warfare work, essentially, trying to win support internationally for the American war effort. And then after the war, after World War I, Bernays became a very prominent pioneer in corporate public relations and advertising. In fact, applying some of the same supposedly scientific psychological techniques of manipulation that he'd learned during the war, but now during peacetime, with the aim of maintaining public order and, of course, of convincing people to buy stuff. Bernays wrote several books about public opinion, public relations, and propaganda in the period between the two world wars, and here's how he began his book titled Propaganda. Quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of." So we can go with that first part, the, quote, conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. We can go with that for kind of our working definition of propaganda. And it's really important to stress that Bernays did not think this manipulation of minds, tastes, and ideas was a bad thing. He was an elitist, a technocrat who was afraid of the chaos of the crowd, the mob, the masses. And he didn't really think that ordinary citizens had the rational capacity to participate in democracy in an intelligent way. Bernays goes on, quote, "In theory, every citizen makes up his mind on public questions and matters of private conduct. In practice, if all men had to study for themselves the abstruse economic, political, and ethical data involved in every question, they would find it impossible to come to a conclusion about anything. We have voluntarily agreed to let an invisible government sift the data and high spot the outstanding issues so that our field of choice shall be narrowed to practical proportions. From our leaders and the media they use to reach us, we accept the evidence and the demarcation of issues bearing upon public questions. From some ethical teacher, be it a minister, a favorite essayist, or merely prevailing opinion, we accept a standardized code of social conduct to which we conform most of the time." So the argument he's making, which should be starting to become familiar by now, is that the world is just too complex for us to make sense of rationally. It's impossible for everyone to actually develop the expertise they need to weigh in productively on complex policy matters or determine what truly is in their interest. Bernays thought that for a democracy to work, ordinary people kind of had to be managed and gently controlled by the elite, not through overt repression and authoritarianism, which could provoke resentment and a backlash, but through kind of the subtle nudges in the right direction that benevolent propaganda could provide, while still allowing people to at least have the impression that they were in control of their lives and their politics. If you want to see some examples and learn more about the corporate and government propaganda campaigns that Bernays actually worked on in his lifetime in the mid-20th century, I highly recommend the documentary The Century of the Self, which I'll add to a link down in the video description, and which I've actually mentioned before in a previous lecture. But to move along, the next thinker, actually from the same era that I want to talk about, is Walter Lippmann, who is a prominent journalist, and he was one of the founders of the New Republic magazine, fun fact, who also was actually mentored and strongly influenced by the pragmatist philosopher William James. And that's significant, I think, because you can see the influence of pragmatist ideas about truth and knowledge on Lippmann. He didn't think that people can ever really access the raw realities of the world independent from cultural worldview or from institutional molding. He didn't think that people could access some ultimate truth corresponding to the realities of the world. So instead, he was more concerned with parsing out who shaped our knowledge, how, and also with ways that we could try to produce as much useful information as possible to allow for better government. Like Bernays, Lippmann worked for that same U.S. Committee for Public Information during the First World War, although Lippmann ended up becoming highly critical, actually, of the work that committee did, and more generally the work that press agents and propagandists like Bernays were doing, both during and after World War I. In his 1922 book, Public Opinion, Lippmann argued that liberal democratic ideals about citizens participating equally in a marketplace of ideas, of forming their own opinions, representing their own interests, and reaching compromises with other interests, he said these ideals really depend on the assumption that citizens could actually know what's going on in the world, right? You can't weigh in rationally and intelligently on a political issue if you don't actually know the facts about the world. And for a lot of the same reasons that some of the other thinkers I've discussed so far, including Edward Bernays, Walter Lippmann thought that the assumption that citizens would be naturally well-informed and have access to unfiltered truths about issues they voted on and opined about absolutely didn't hold up. Right? He said that the assumptions on which liberal democratic ideals rest don't really hold up in reality, in the real world. Rather than having unfiltered access to the world, to our real environment, Lippmann said, what we have access to is a pseudo-environment of representations. And this argument should be familiar by now, right, from Stuart Hall in particular. The world in all its complexity doesn't make sense to us, doesn't have meaning until a simplified representation of it is produced that we can make sense of. And in order to deal with complexity and with information overload, we rely on stereotypes, kind of quick and dirty ways of making sense of things. And Lippmann, by the way, is actually the first person to use the term stereotype in this kind of more modern sense. So all these representations of the world, all these stereotypes put together create what Lippmann called a pseudo-environment in which we all live. Lippmann isn't saying that pseudo-environments are necessarily bad things, right? Don't let the prefix pseudo make you think he's saying, oh, there are pseudo-environments and that's bad, they're fake. Really, we should all be looking at the real environment. Lippmann is not saying a pseudo-environment is inherently good or bad, just that it's simply inevitable, right? That's how human intelligence works, right? So with the term pseudo-environment, he's just describing how he thinks societies work, how people collectively make sense of the world. So in this sense, pseudo-environments are as ubiquitous to humanity as is culture. In a sense, it's another word for culture, or a word for the worldview that culture produces. That said, what Lippmann, like other thinkers we've come across, did think was a big problem. What he did think was a big problem was that the powerful exercised a whole lot of control over the contours, over the makeup of the pseudo environment. Lippmann saw that politicians, governments, big corporations, and so on were, actually with help from people like Edward Bernays, they were able to shape public perceptions of reality and so public opinion through propaganda. Now, at this point, democratic idealists might say, well, look, that's where the free press comes in, right? Journalism is supposed to function as a check on the powerful by dispelling and debunking and fact-checking the myths that powerful liars and bullshitters put out there. But Lippmann, speaking from professional experience as a journalist, didn't think that the press could really balance out the pseudo-environment on its own. Even if journalists did their best to be independent of these powerful interests and tried to create an image of the world that served the interests of people beyond just the elite, their ability to do so was extremely limited. The press was, in Lippmann's view, in a way kind of superstructural to an informational base provided by institutions like statistics bureaus and universities. Journalists simply don't have the time or resources or expertise to be consistently taking measurements of all different parts of the world. They might do like an in-depth investigation of one issue and collect data on their own, but as we saw discussed in gatekeeping theory and by others, there's a lot of pressure on journalists to be constantly shifting their attention to whatever is exciting and novel and has people riled up, right? That's a big part of newsworthiness. So unlike a publicly funded statistics bureau, a newspaper or a TV station can't ever really afford to employ people full-time just to do the important but boring work of, say, compiling crime or health or economic statistics. And so journalists themselves, in order to make sense of what's going on, in order to find patterns and trends and find issues to report on, journalists themselves depend on these kind of institutions and the information that they produce. Journalists can act as kind of like a roving spotlight, right, bringing public attention to one particular issue for a short period of time. But for the endless work of building up the information base on which the pseudo-environment rests, you need institutions. So, for example, take the GDP, the gross domestic product, the measure of the total output of a country's economy. If you look at economic reporting today, you'll see GDP and GDP per capita statistics all over the place as a measure for how well a country is doing and how well the people living in them are doing. Now, in Lippmann's day, in the 1920s, nobody was measuring the GDP. Nobody was measuring the gross domestic product of the United States, or I think of anywhere else. It was only in the 1930s, in fact, after the Great Depression hit and Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president and appointed a bunch of smart people to try to fix the economy, that the US government even defined GDP and began collecting and compiling data and publicly reporting the size and the growth of the economy. So you can imagine if a reporter before that, in the 1920s, wanted to write or even think about economic problems, they'd have fewer tools available to do so. They might cite stock market prices for big companies or tell kind of anecdotal stories about individual families struggling to put food on the table, or maybe they try to compile some kind of rudimentary data themselves, like by asking shopkeepers every week how business was, how much they were charging for food staples, this kind of thing. But without a big, well-resourced institution, without organized intelligence, as Lippmann called it, without institutions like the U.S. Treasury or Bureau of Labor Statistics or United Nations or international NGOs or university or whoever else is systematically collecting large-scale data, journalists simply couldn't know all that much about the world or about how much it was changing. And that's still a problem today, right? I mean, we do collect GDP, but lots of people argue that GDP and GDP per capita aren't actually a great measure of how people overall are doing. But because that is one of the measures that's out there getting produced by institutions, it does end up being something that journalists return to over and over. And in a sense, it's something that both produces and limits the conversation about human welfare. So I hope that explanation and that example can kind of help us to make sense of what I think is an important passage from Lippmann's book, Public Opinion. He writes, quote, "The quality of the news about modern society is an index of its social organization. The better the institutions, the more all interests concerned are formally represented, the more its issues are disentangled, the more objective criteria are introduced, the more perfectly an affair can be presented as news. At its best, the press is a servant and a guardian of institutions. At its worst, it is a means by which a few exploit social disorganization to their own ends." He goes on, "The press is no substitute for institutions. It is like the beam of a searchlight that moves restlessly about, bringing one episode and then another out of darkness into vision. Men cannot do the work of the world by this light alone. They cannot govern society by episodes, incidents, and eruptions. It is only when they work by a steady light of their own that the press, when it is turned upon them, reveals a situation intelligible enough for a popular decision." So, in a certain sense, Lippmann did reach a similar kind of elitist, technocratic conclusion to Edward Bernays, that the masses of ordinary citizens and even journalists couldn't be trusted to make sense of the world on their own. They were too dependent on information from institutions and too vulnerable to manipulation, and so needed the guidance of an enlightened elite. But whereas Bernays had no problem with partisan, political, and corporate elites running the show, providing this guiding hand, controlling the pseudo environment from behind the scenes with propaganda, Lippmann thought that there needed to be independent pillars of truth-telling in society. He thought that there had to be a specialized professional class of data gatherers and analysts for institutions, like, again, statistics bureaus, universities, and so on, who provided information that journalists could then use in the public interest. And this is a sentiment that you might remember Hannah Arendt is going to share a few decades later in her article Truth and Politics, when she says that there needs to be a place in society for those stubborn, independent, apolitical truth tellers. The issue of journalistic dependence on other institutions is one that, as a reminder, it comes up in gatekeeping theory when Shoemaker and Vos talk about the social institutional level of gatekeeping analysis. And it's also one that Lucas Graves talks about in his book on fact-checking, Deciding What's True. Graves points out that fact-checkers are heavily dependent on what he calls institutional facts when they try to assess many kinds of claims, many of the most important kinds of claims. So a politician, for example, might say that the economy's never been so good and that he deserves credit for the economy's growth. Well, no fact-checker can really figure that out on their own, right? There isn't like an economy out there that they can go and interview. So what they need to do is they need to ask institutions for data about GDP, about unemployment, whatever, in order to assess the politician's claims, right? They're dependent on institutional facts. The problem, though, which Lippmann didn't really foresee in his day, is that institutions have not actually been able to escape the trap of bias or accusations of bias. They haven't been able to achieve kind of unquestioned acceptance as objective just because they use scientific methods. Lippmann was living in an era of, I think in some ways, a bit more optimism about the potential for the application of scientific methods, statistical analysis, and experimentation and all that to produce objective knowledge. We're now a bit more jaded about the ways that researchers can lie with statistics and manipulate experimental data, and we're less likely to think of social scientists as independent, as above the fray of politics, the way that many people did back in the early 20th century. And of course, there have been many decades since Walter Lippmann's day of propagandists working explicitly to corrupt science, to co-opt scientists to tell, their dishonest side of the story, to bullshit on their behalf, this kind of thing, right? Like big tobacco paying for studies that prove that cigarettes didn't cause cancer, this kind of thing, right? Decades of fossil fuel industries funding science denying climate change. And so, as Graves points out, when it comes to today's fact-checking, contentious issues very often are never settled, right? Because what happens is there's always kind of a back and forth between fact-checkers and their rivals, whether those rivals are politicians themselves or media watchdog organizations or the corporations that fact-checkers are reporting on, or competing fact-checkers. Because what we see nowadays is what happens is there are different institutions producing conflicting facts and criticizing one another's interpretations of their data, and often those different competing institutions are affiliated with different political or economic factions. And so a fact checker might mark a politician's claim about the economy as false because the expert they interview from one institution, maybe a university, gives them data that shows that really actually, let's say, wages and total factor productivity are stagnant. But then maybe a media watchdog fact checks the fact checker, and they say they're biased because if you look at data from this other institution, right, maybe, I don't know, a non-governmental think tank, if you look at their data, it actually looks like the economy is doing great. And that other expert might even tell them that the university professor who the fact checker relied on was biased and ignoring some of the most important positive indicators of the economy. And it can really just kind of go on and on like this ad infinitum, right, with different institutions forming the informational base for rival pseudo-environments, rival worldviews that each represent different partisan and class interests. The other problem that I think Lippmann didn't really solve or even really think about was the problem of too much information or too much organized information, right? He and Bernays both did point out that, okay, the world's complex, it's difficult for people to make sense of without institutions kind of organizing the data for them and making sense of it and offering expert interpretations. But nonetheless, Lippmann did think that kind of the more information that was produced, certified by these kinds of knowledge-producing institutions and made retrievable to journalists and to the public, he thought that the more information that was put out there, basically the more interest could be represented and the more fairly the public sphere could operate. But nowadays, we're just kind of drowning in information from a million different sources. There are all, as I've mentioned, lots of different rival competing institutions, and it hasn't really fixed the problems that Lippmann identified a century ago. As Jacques Ellul is going to argue in his book that I'll discuss in the next part of this lecture, the availability of a near infinity of information can actually make people more inclined to seek a certain kind of comfort in the simplifications of propaganda. So that's coming up next. Thanks for watching so far, and please stick around for part 2.